The streets of Lomé, Togo's capital, are choked with black smoke from burning tires. Young men, their faces hidden by makeshift masks, are dragging concrete blocks to build barricades. The air is thick with tear gas as security forces in full riot gear advance on the crowds. This is Togo in June 2025, a nation that's been pushed right to the edge. For 3 days, protesters have been clashing with police, all demanding one thing: the resignation of their leader. The government's answer has been swift, and it has been brutal. Human rights groups are reporting that at least 7 people have been killed. Dozens more have been arrested, and some have allegedly been tortured in detention. But this explosion of anger didn't just come out of nowhere. It's the boarding over of nearly 60 years of frustration. It's a direct reaction to one family's ever-tightening grip on this West African nation of 9 million people. The protesters' chant is simple, and it cuts straight to the heart of the problem. 50 years is too long. So how did we get here? How has a single family, the Nassingbays, managed to rule a country for longer than most of its citizens have been alive? To understand the fire on the streets of Loma today, you have to go back and understand the dynasty that lit the fuse. Our story starts not in a palace, but in the army barracks. It's 1963. Togo is a brand new country, only 3 years out from under French colonial rule. Its first president, Sylvanus Olympio, is already facing a lot of pressure. One of his most fateful decisions was to turn away Togolese soldiers who were coming home after serving in the French colonial armies. He refused to bring them into Togo's new, much smaller military. One of those soldiers, a demobilized sergeant, was a man named Nassingbe Iadema. On January 13, 1963, in what became the very first military coup in post-colonial sub-Saharan Africa, a group of soldiers led by Iadema assassinated President Olympio. Iadema didn't grab power right away. He and his fellow soldiers put a civilian, Nicholas Granitsky, in the president's chair. But the move made one thing crystal clear: the real power was now with the military, and at its head was Iadema. He stayed in the background for 4 years, playing the role of a quiet kingmaker. But the new government was shaky, plagued by instability and tensions between different ethnic groups. On January 13, 1967, exactly 4 years to the day after the first coup, Iadema, now a lieutenant colonel and chief of staff, decided he'd seen enough. He staged another coup, a bloodless one this time. He dissolved all political parties and took the presidency for himself. This was the real beginning of the Nassingbe dynasty. Iadema moved fast to lock down his power. In 1969, he created a one-party state under his own banner, the Rally of the Togolese People, RPT. Any political opposition was crushed, and crushed brutally. Human rights groups would later document a regime of pure repression, filled with political assassinations and violent crackdowns on any protest. He built up a powerful cult of personality around himself and filled the security forces and top government jobs with loyalists, many from his own Kabi ethnic group. This created a fiercely loyal system designed to protect his rule for decades. He was also smart about his international friends. By making Togo a reliable anti-communist partner during the Cold War, he got the backing of Western powers, especially France, who were often willing to look the other way on his abuses at home. He nationalized the country's rich phosphate industry in 1974, which sent a flood of money into the government's pockets and tightened his financial control even further. Throughout the 70s and 80s, his power was absolute. He kept winning these sham, uncontested elections with vote counts that were just laughable, often claiming he'd won over 99% of the vote. But by the early 1990s, a wave of pro-democracy movements was sweeping across Africa, and it hit Togo too. Under huge pressure, Iadema had to agree to a national conference in 1991, which drafted a new democratic constitution and made other political parties legal. That new constitution even had a 2-term limit for the president, which was a huge deal for the opposition. It looked like a new day for Togo, but it was a false dawn. Iadema was a master political survivor, and he never really let go of the reins. The transition was a mess of violence and intimidation, and by 1993, he was running for president again. He won, but the election was a disaster, full of accusations of fraud. He won again in 1998, under pretty much the same circumstances. Protests were met with violence, and a joint report from the UN and the Organization of African Unity later confirmed that the government had systematically violated human rights during the election. Then, in 2002, he made his final play to secure his legacy. He had the parliament, which was packed with his supporters, vote to scrap the presidential term limits from the constitution he'd been forced to accept a decade earlier. The path was now clear for him to rule for life. For 38 years, Gnassingbé Eyadema held Togo in an iron grip. He built a system for one purpose: to last. But even he couldn't outrun death. In February 2005, Eyadema died suddenly, leaving a power vacuum. The system he had so carefully built was about to face its first real test. The constitution was pretty clear on what should happen next. If the president dies, the head of the National Assembly is supposed to take over as acting president and organize new elections within 60 days. But that's not what happened. Within hours of Eyadema's death, the military, the true backbone of the regime, made its move. They sealed the country's borders and announced that Eyadema's son, Faure Gnassingbé, was the new president. The international community was furious. The African Union called it what it was: a military coup. Togo's neighbors hit them with sanctions. For a few weeks, it looked like the dynasty might actually fall apart. But Faure, facing all this pressure, played his cards very cleverly. He stepped down, agreed to an election, and let the constitutional process play out. Or at least, he made it look that way. The presidential election was held in April 2005. Faure Gnassingbé was declared the winner. The opposition immediately cried foul, pointing to massive fraud and voter intimidation. Violence exploded across the country. In the brutal crackdown that followed, hundreds of people were killed, and about 40,000 Togolese had to flee to neighboring countries. But despite the bloodshed and the contested result, Faure Gnassingbé had the presidency. The son had inherited his father's throne, not with a smooth coronation, but through chaos and violence. The dynasty had survived. For the next 20 years, Faure Gnassingbé's rule would feel like a more polished, modern version of his father's. He talked about reform and reconciliation, and his regime wasn't as openly brutal. He even managed to get international aid and investment flowing back into the country. But underneath that shiny surface, the core of the system was exactly the same. The security forces were still run by loyalists. The ruling party, now rebranded as the Union for the Republic, UNRR, still completely dominated politics, and the opposition was still fighting for its life in a hostile environment. The slogan "Faure must go" became a regular chant for protesters, but every time they rose up, they were pushed back down. A huge point of conflict was the issue of presidential term limits, the very thing his father had gotten rid of. After massive protests in 2017 and 2018, Faure's government finally gave in. In 2019, term limits were put back into the constitution. The opposition celebrated it as a major victory, but there was a catch. A tiny little detail that would change everything. The limits were not retroactive. This meant the 15 years Faure had already been in power just didn't count. He was now free to run for 2 more terms, which could keep him in office all the way to 2030. He easily won the 2020 election, and once again, there were accusations of major irregularities. The opposition had won a battle, but the Gnassingbé regime was getting ready to win the war. The promise of the dynasty, finally ending in 2030, felt empty to a lot of people. They'd seen this move before: give a small concession to release some pressure, then make a strategic move to take back that ground. They wouldn't have to wait long to see what was next, and this time, it would be the move that pushed Togo to its breaking point. This cycle of twisting constitutions and the public pushing back is a pattern you see in a lot of countries where leaders want to hang on to power. Understanding how these systems are built and challenged is more important than ever. If you find this look into Togo's story insightful, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We get into complex stories like this every week, explaining not just what's happening, but also why it matters. Your support helps us keep bringing these important stories to light. By early 2024, the political tension in Togo was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Faure Gnassingbé's final constitutional term was supposed to end in 2025, and the country was bracing for what everyone hoped would be a historic transfer of power. But the Gnassingbé regime had one more trick up its sleeve. In March 2024, the parliament, which is overwhelmingly controlled by Faure's UNIA party, made a shocking announcement. They had voted to approve a new constitution. This wasn't just some small change. It was a complete rewrite of the country's entire system of government. The new constitution got rid of direct presidential elections. From now on, the president would be picked by parliament, not by the people. This new presidential role would be mostly ceremonial, with just a single term limit. At first glance, you might think, okay, a move to a parliamentary democracy, but the devil was in the details. The reform created a brand new powerful position, the President of the Council of Ministers. This role is basically a prime minister on steroids, holding all the real executive power, control over the government, the military, everything. And here's the kicker. This new position has no term limits at all. The opposition immediately called it a constitutional coup. It was such a clear and obvious plan to let Ford Gnassingbé sidestep the very term limits he'd agreed to just a few years before. The plan was simple. His party, which controls almost every seat in parliament, would just appoint him as the all-powerful president of the Council of Ministers, a job he could hold for the rest of his life. The people's right to choose their own leader was wiped out with a single vote, and they didn't even get a referendum. The government moved quickly to cement its power. Legislative elections that had been pushed back again and again were finally held in April 2024, but under a dark cloud of repression. Protests were banned, opposition figures were arrested, and foreign journalists were kicked out or denied entry. The result was no surprise. Ford's UNIA party won 108 out of 113 seats. With a rubber-stamp legislature now in place, the path was clear. In May 2025, Ford Gnassingbé was officially appointed as the first president of the Council of Ministers. He had successfully switched from a job with term limits to a new, more powerful one with none. The dynasty was now set up to rule forever. For so many Togolese, this was the last straw. The rising cost of living and decades of anger over corruption and repression were now mixed with a powerful new feeling, the theft of their vote. When a popular rapper and government critic named Amron was arrested, it lit a spark. In June 2025, calls for protests spread like wildfire on social media. Despite a government ban on demonstrations that had been in place since 2022, people poured into the streets. These protests weren't just about a new law, they were about a broken promise, a stolen future. They were a raw, gut-level rejection of a system that had, for nearly 60 years, treated their country like a family business. The government's violent response only made people angrier. Reports from Amnesty International and local rights groups detailed the brutality, beatings, mass arrests, and even torture. One protester, speaking to a journalist, summed up the mood perfectly. "This country doesn't belong to you or the Gnassingbé family. Just let go of the country." The story of the Gnassingbé family's rule in Togo is a masterclass in how modern authoritarianism really works. It's not always a single dramatic power grab. It's often a slow, methodical chipping away at institutions. It's the art of the constitutional coup, of bending laws, and of patiently building a system where every lever of power, the military, the courts, the legislature, answers to just one person. It all started with Gnassingbé Ibrahim, a soldier who took power in a coup and then spent 4 decades building a regime based on loyalty, fear, and foreign friends. He created a system so strong that it could be passed down from father to son, a very rare thing in the messy world of post-colonial African politics. His son, Ford Gnassingbé, inherited that system and has spent 2 decades perfecting it, trading the iron fist for a velvet glove that still has the same hard knuckles underneath. He has mastered the performance of democracy, giving concessions like term limits, only to make them totally meaningless with a clever legal trick. The new 2024 Constitution is the masterpiece of this strategy. It's a machine designed to look like change, while actually locking in permanent rule. By creating a new, all-powerful job with no term limits, Ford Gnassingbé has tried to solve the succession problem for good. He's no longer just a president, he is the system. But the scenes from Lomé show that the people of Togo are not just sitting back and watching this happen. Their anger, which has been simmering for decades, has finally boiled over. The government's brutal crackdown might clear the streets for a little while, but it can't kill the desire for change. Togo is now at a dangerous crossroads. The Gnassingbé dynasty has made its boldest move yet to lock down its rule for another generation. The people have answered with their loudest no to date. The future of this small West African nation hangs in the balance, caught between a family that refuses to let go and a people who are refusing to give up. The question now isn't if the breaking point has been reached, but what happens when everything finally shatters. Tell us what you think in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Thanks for watching.